So this first slide, one of the first years we were growing hemp, we had prepared a seed bed and then it started getting wet and we had to wait quite a while for things to dry out enough to be able to have Burton to come in and do the seeding for us. And because we had such a separation there, we were able to go in and kill all of the weeds that had established after our primary tillage. So we went into the stale seed bed about a month later and seeded the hemp. And as far as weed control right now, that's like the best option from what we've been able to come together. You take care of the first flush of weeds and then establish the hemp. And we didn't have a lot of weeds come into that area. This picture is taken on a corner of the plot where we hadn't even sprayed any herbicides. So you can see, other than the hemp, there's not a lot of weeds there. Unfortunately, while Canada has a couple of options for herbicides to kill weeds right before seeding, as far as I know, we still do not have anything. So you think, oh, glyphosate doesn't affect anything. Well, even glyphosate has on their label, you have to wait 30 days before you can seed hemp. So that puts you out quite a ways from when you are establishing the seed bed to be able to get the hemp in the ground and still be abiding by the label. So when we get that crop established, and of course we've got varied seed maturity has been talked about, and it kind of almost seems that we get the best yield when we start seeing some of the bird feeding underneath the plants. So we know we're dropping some seed in order to make sure that we have the highest amount of mature seed to be able to harvest. But then that also means when you're letting some of that seed fall to the ground, it's potential for volunteers the next season. And even though a lot of the recommendations for seeding date puts us into June, here's the first week of May, the first weeds that we were seeing establishing in the fields, areas where we've had our hemp trials, has always been volunteer hemp. You can see here that it's out of the ground before wild buckwheat, it's out of the ground before mallow, it's established before wild mustard, and even comes up before wild oat. So it definitely has the ability to emerge and establish early on in the season, as well as germinate through the first several weeks of the next crop production. So we started looking at what we might be able to use to control some of these volunteer plants. And so if you want to grab a picture of this, take a picture of the screen so that you have it, and it's fine with me. But so we've got two trials that we set up. One is in wheat herbicides, and another one was with row crop herbicides. But so across the bottom, we have the different products that we had been using. And we're typically putting these out at what we would consider just a standard use rate if we were going to be including them in a wheat herbicide program, and listed by trade name across the bottom. Percent control is on the y-axis, and we did have this last year at two locations, one here in Fargo and another spot out at Castleton. And this year's information is fairly consistent with what we had observed the previous year out of a couple trials as well. So we're starting to get a pretty good volume of information to help us give growers some recommendations. You see with a lot of these products, we're not exceeding 90% control. This line there where I've got my dot. Really, to keep the growers happy, I think 90% control is kind of a minimum. With a lot of the companies, they say 80% control is their threshold for when somebody's going to give them a call or not. And from what we've been working with over the last couple of years, I kind of put hemp into the same volunteer management category as flax. We have a lot of products that damage flax enough so that we can't get anything registered in them, but not good enough control so that it completely removes it from the canopy. And we rely on the crop that we are growing to finish off and keep those damaged plants from becoming a nuisance later in the season. So products like Comet and Pixaro have fluroxapyr in them, or starane, you may be familiar with. And that starane component seems to work quite well. And you get up above 80% control at least. Elevore is a product that can only be used pre-emergence. It's another new growth regulator, but it is really not providing very much activity on these volunteer hemp plants at all. Similar to dicamba, on the line list a little bit here, we were very surprised at the minimal activity we got from dicamba. And we were spraying hemp plants that were probably second to third pair of leaves. They were fairly small yet, 6 inches at best. But we really did not see very much of the typical dicamba symptomology on the plants at all. Sword is an MCPA, and that was not as good as 2,4-D. Salvo is a 2,4-D product. So there again, we're getting up to 80 to 90% control. As we move to the right, Husky and Talinor are two very capable products if the plants are really small. In general, broadleaf weed control up to about 3 inches. And so with these hemp plants being 5 inches tall, we were worried that we wouldn't be able to kill enough of the tissue to prevent regrowth. And I'll show you some pictures in a little bit, and that's exactly what happened. And then the last group is all ALS inhibitors, group 2 herbicides. Some of them specifically for broadleaf, some of them like the Everest, Teammate, and Barrow are more for wild oat and green foxtail control. But because they are group 2 herbicides, they still have good activity on several broadleaf weeds. And even though we didn't reach 90% control with many of these, because the activity of group 2 herbicides persists in the plant, they were doing a very, very effective job of preventing the plant from continuing to put out new tissue. So now I've got a few photos we'll show. Difference, Elevore on the left, which was not providing good activity at all, but Culex has Elevore and then a group 2 herbicide called flurazilam. And that flurazilam is a good product for a lot of the Canadian geography weed spectrum. And we can see that it was quite effective on helping eliminate the vegetation growth from hemp plants as well. Differences in the growth regulators. You can see 2,4-D and starane type product like Comet on the outsides here. The starane product especially was very effective at twisting up the plants and preventing new growth. 2,4-D was starting to allow some of these leaf clusters. You can see we got some new leaves coming out, and with the MCPA, we had several leaf pairs coming out after the application. So underneath here, we've got plants twisted up, but the MCPA was not preventing the growing point for putting out new tissue. So was definitely not going to be an effective long-term treatment. The Husky on the left side, that Husky and Talinor I was talking about, they are very fast acting. Within a week, we had a lot of desiccated leaf tissue, but if we don't get good enough coverage, that growing point, because of the size of the plant, is able to regenerate new tissue. And so you can see we've got some fairly healthy leaf clusters coming out from the top of 4 to 5 inch tall sticks, basically, that are devoid of other vegetation. And then on the right side, Affinity is one of the group 2 herbicides, and it translocates to the growing point, and similar to the starane, really prevented new leaf tissue from coming out and looking very healthy. And the new tissue that came out is very chlorotic. Older leaf tissue is starting to desiccate and fall off of the plant. So if we had this in a crop canopy, I wouldn't be too concerned about the hemp surviving and coming back to be a harvest problem late in the season. We did the same thing with several row crop herbicides, used corn, soybean, dry bean, some of the other crops. And as you can see across the line here, everything's kind of basically set up the same way as the previous figure was. In general, we don't have as many high quality options for managing hemp in row crops. Now, most of the row crops would be going back into a broadleaf crop, so it's not something that we would be recommending anyway. We want to diversify that crop system and typically try to follow a broadleaf with a grass crop. But Liberty, even though that is a product, it's non-selective, but it's kind of really targeted as a contact herbicide. We have very substantial activity, very strong control levels. And then also the Basagran right next to it, near 90% control at both locations. Very effectively desiccated existing tissue to the extent that it was difficult for the plant to regenerate new growth from that growing point. And other than those two, we've got a lot of situations where you're just kind of tickling those hemp plants a little bit and deforming them a little bit maybe, but left alone in a crop canopy that does not close very effectively, the hemp would definitely be a problem mid-season and beyond. Even with Callisto and Impact, Group 27 herbicides, the HPPD inhibitors, those are getting a lot of people are interested in those now because of their pigweed activity to help with water hemp and in some areas Palmer amaranth control. But we're not getting enough activity from that site of action to kill hemp, and we get enough damage so that the companies are definitely not going to be interested in registering for use. Back to some pictures on the left side here, Beyond and Raptor. Even though they are also group 2 herbicides, these are imidazolinones, and they are not as effective as the sulfonylureas or the triazolapyrimidines, the other ones that were on the wheat list. So we get a lot of stunting typically. We were actually looking at possibly trying to get a registration for one of these products because the first time we used it, there was about 30% height reduction. We still had plethora of seeds being produced, and we were looking at it as kind of almost a harvest aid because we can keep the plants shorter so we don't have to put so much through the combine. But depending on the environment, we can get fairly substantial damage. And there's that Callisto HPPD inhibitor. We were able to eliminate some of the leaves, but we've got a lot of new leaf pair clusters coming out and producing new leaves as the season goes on. We have in the middle here is Basagran, and as you can imagine, the Liberty treatment looked like that, even a little bit better. We really eliminated the majority of the plants that had established, and there were just a couple of plants in the plot, whether it was Basagran or Liberty. There were just a couple that would be surviving and producing some new leaf tissue. Metribuzin caused a lot of damage initially, but then it didn't keep the growing point from coming back. And Flexstar, Reflex type product did not cause very much leaf damage at all. And so the plants grew out of that injury quite quickly.